Have you ever noticed the exact moment a woman becomes unreachable? Not cold, not bitter, not broken, unreachable. It doesn't happen with a slammed door or a screaming match. It doesn't announce itself with a dramatic speech or a final ultimatum. It happens in a single, quiet, internal moment that nobody else in the room even notices. One day, she is still trying, still reaching, still crafting the perfect words to make someone finally understand her, and then, without warning, she simply stops. She stops explaining. She stops defending. She stops translating herself into a language that was never designed to understand her in the first place. And the terrifying thing, the thing that keeps people up at night, is that once a woman reaches that point, no apology on earth can bring her back. Most people misread this shift entirely. They see a woman who has gone quiet and they immediately fill in the story themselves. They assume she's sulking, they decide she's playing games, they convince themselves she's just being difficult, that if they push hard enough or wait long enough, she'll eventually crack and go back to over-explaining. Her every move like she always did before. They are wrong. What they are witnessing isn't a tantrum. It isn't manipulation. It is the single most significant psychological transformation a woman can undergo. It is the moment she stops performing her own existence for an audience that was never paying attention anyway. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the architecture of the human psyche, and what he found explains exactly why this shift is so misunderstood. Jung discovered that most people spend the majority of their lives living through what he called the persona, the carefully constructed social mask we wear to be accepted, loved, and deemed worthy by the world around us. For women especially, this mask is built early and reinforced constantly. Be agreeable, be available, be soft enough that no one feels threatened by you. Explain yourself clearly so no one misunderstands. Justify your feelings so they seem reasonable. Make yourself legible to everyone, even the people who have never once tried to read you. The woman who stops explaining herself has done something radical. She has finally looked at that mask, held it up to the light, and put it down forever. This isn't a decision she makes lightly. This isn't a phase or a mood or a strategy to win a power struggle. It is the conclusion of a long, exhausting internal war, a war that most people around her never even knew she was fighting. Think about what it costs a woman to keep explaining herself. Every time she senses a misunderstanding, she mobilizes. She searches for better words. She reframes her feelings into something more palatable. She softens her tone, adds qualifiers, removes edges, and wraps her truth in layer after layer of apology just to make it safe. Enough for someone else to receive. She does this not once or twice, but thousands of times, across years, across relationships, across boardrooms and bedrooms and family dinner tables where her words are always just slightly too much or just slightly not enough. And each time she goes through this ritual of self-reduction, she chips away at something inside herself, something quiet and essential. Jung called it the self with a capital S, the deep, authentic core of who a person truly is beneath the masks and the performances and the social negotiations. Every time she shrinks her truth to fit someone else's comfort, that self grows a little quieter, a little more distant, until one day she realizes she can barely hear it anymore. That is the moment everything changes. Because the silence that follows isn't emptiness. It is the sound of a woman finally turning inward, finally listening to the voice she has spent years drowning out with explanations nobody asked for and apologies nobody deserved. The outside world hears nothing and mistakes that nothing for defeat, but inside, something monumental is happening. She is remembering who she was before the world told her she needed to justify that person's existence. Here is what nobody tells you about a woman who stops explaining herself. She doesn't stop because she no longer cares. She stops because she has finally cared enough about herself to recognize a fundamental truth. You cannot reason someone into valuing you. You cannot explain your way into another person's respect if someone requires a 10-paragraph defense of your basic dignity before they will treat you like a human being. The problem was never your articulation. The problem is that they decided your worth before you even opened your mouth. When she understands this, truly understands it in her bones and not just her head, the exhausting machinery of self-justification simply powers down, not with a crash, with a click, and in the silence that follows that click, she begins to rebuild. Jung described a process he called individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming the person you were always meant to be, stripped of all the identities that were handed to you by other people. For the woman who stops explaining herself, this is where individuation truly begins, because for the first time she is no longer building her identity around how she is perceived. She is building it around who she actually is. This transition is not comfortable. Let's be honest about that. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with it. The grief of realizing that many of the relationships she poured herself into were built on a version of her that was willing to make herself small, when she stops shrinking, some of those relationships cannot survive. The expansion. People who loved her compliance will mistake her silence for arrogance. People who depended on her endless explanations will call her cold. People who were used to having total access to her internal world will suddenly feel locked out and will blame her for the lock. She will be called difficult. She will be called changed, and not in a good way. They'll make sure she knows that. She will be called intimidating by people who simply mean that she no longer fears their disapproval. She will let them call her whatever they need to. Because here is the secret on the other side of all those labels. When you stop explaining yourself to people who were never genuinely listening, you discover something extraordinary. The right people don't need the explanation. The people who are meant to be in her life don't require a dissertation on why her feelings are valid. They don't need her to perform her worthiness. They simply see her. They meet her where she is, without the exhausting negotiation, without the 10-round debate about whether her boundaries are reasonable, without making her feel like a defendant in her own life. And the contrast between those two kinds of people, the ones who demanded constant explanation and the ones who simply showed up, becomes so stark and so undeniable that she wonders how she spent so long confusing the first kind for love. This is where her power becomes truly dangerous, not dangerous in a threatening sense, dangerous in the way that the truth is dangerous, dangerous in the way that clarity is dangerous to anyone who has been operating in your fog. A woman who has stopped explaining herself has also stopped giving people the raw material they need to gaslight her. Think about what gaslighting requires. It requires your participation. It requires you to be in a constant state of uncertainty about your own perceptions so that someone else can step in and offer their version of reality as the correct one. But when a woman has gone quiet and turned inward, when she has stopped narrating her inner world to people who only ever used that narration against her, the gaslighter reaches for the script and finds nothing there. There is no self-doubt to exploit. There is no frantic explanation to twist. There is only a woman who knows exactly what she knows and has stopped needing anyone else to confirm it. She becomes, in Jung's language, psychologically sovereign, sovereignty, not hardness. This distinction matters enormously, and it is the one that most people who witness this transformation completely miss. They see a woman who no longer over-explains and they assume she has built a wall. They imagine her behind thick stone, sealed off from feeling unreachable not by choice but by damage. They want her stillness to be a wound because a wound is something they can eventually treat, manipulate, or use as leverage. But she isn't walled off, she is simply whole. There is a profound difference between a woman who cannot let people in and a woman who has simply raised the standard for who she lets in. One is operating from fear, the other is operating from knowledge. She has learned through years of hard and often painful experience that her inner world is a sacred space, not because she was told to believe that, because she has watched what happens when she throws that space open to people who track dirt through it without apology. She has seen the cost of unlimited access, and she is no longer willing to pay it. Her boundaries are not a punishment, they are a reflection of her self-knowledge, and this is the part that truly unnerves people, because in a world that has been trained to believe that a woman's value lies in her openness, her warmth, her endless emotional availability, a woman who has reclaimed authority over her own access is a direct challenge to that entire framework. She is living proof that a woman does not need to justify her existence to earn the right to exist comfortably within it. She doesn't need your understanding to know that she is understood by the person who matters most, herself. Watch what happens to the people around a woman like this. Watch the ones who depended on her explanations as a source of power. They become frantic in their attempts to pull a reaction from her. They escalate, they provoke, they bring in old grievances, resurrect ancient arguments, and make grand declarations designed to crack her open again. They need her to respond, to defend, to explain, because as long as she is explaining herself, they have something to argue with. They have a foothold. When she refuses to provide that foothold, they don't know where to stand. And that is when the mask slips on their end. That is when she finally sees, with crystalline and unmerciful clarity, that much of what she took for connection was actually control. The long conversations she thought were intimacy were often interrogations dressed in soft lighting. The constant need for her to justify her feelings wasn't curiosity. It was a mechanism to keep her doubting herself just enough to stay manageable. She sees it now, and she cannot unsee it. This is not a story about bitterness. I want to be absolutely clear about that. This is not a story about a woman who has hardened against the world or sworn off trust or decided that people are fundamentally not worth her time. This is a story about a woman who has completed a chapter, the chapter where she outsourced her self-worth to external validation. The chapter where she believed, even slightly, that she owed the world an explanation for taking up space. That chapter is finished. What comes next is something entirely different. It is a woman who still loves deeply, more deeply than before. In fact, because now that love isn't contaminated by desperation, it is a woman who still connects, still laughs, still shows up for the people who have earned that presence, but she does it from fullness now, not from fear. She does it because she chooses to, not because she is terrified of what happens if she doesn't. The woman who stopped explaining herself didn't lose her voice. She finally started using it for the right audience, herself first, and then selectively and unapologetically the people who deserve to hear it. This is your signal. If you are reading this and feeling a specific weight in your chest, that particular exhaustion that comes from years of translating yourself into versions that are safer and smaller and more digestible for people who never truly wanted to understand you, hear this clearly. You are not too complicated. You are not too sensitive. You are not too much. You have simply been in the wrong rooms. The right room doesn't require you to earn your seat at the table by explaining yourself endlessly. The right room recognizes you when you walk in, without a presentation, without a defense, without a 12-point case for why your feelings are legitimate. Stop rehearsing your justifications. Stop softening your edges for people who mistake your sharpness for a threat. Stop translating your truth into a dialect that was designed specifically to silence it. Go quiet, turn inward, and let that silence do what no explanation ever could. Let it show you and everyone watching exactly who you are when you stop trying to convince the wrong people that you're worth knowing. Because the woman who stops explaining herself isn't disappearing, she is arriving, for the very first time, fully. And without apology, she is finally here. Share this with a woman who has been exhausted by the sound of her own voice trying to be heard by people who were never truly listening. It might be the permission she's been waiting for to finally go quiet, and in that quiet, find herself.